sense that it forced you in that very compact amount of time to think seriously about what you do, how you teach, what your goals in the classroom are, what you research, why it's important, what you do in terms of service, and thinking about that. And we don't often have the opportunity to really sort of sit down and kind of reflect on this and contemplate it. Not that we really did in 3.5 days, but a little bit more than maybe on our daily basis. And so if maybe I could add to what Dr. Harp has already said, I put together a couple slides that are some specific things that I took away from the workshop, things that as I have continued to work on my portfolio over the last 3 weeks since the workshop, what is it that I've taken away as the most valuable things that I learned? What has really helped me in a very practical sense? And so these tips are maybe a little bit more practical than some of what you've already heard. And I realize that we're beyond the witching hour, but there were copies of this PowerPoint that were passed out to you. One of the very first things that Dr. Selden mentioned to us was this idea that the portfolio should be evidence-based. And this is particularly important. Dr. Allen mentioned this earlier, and this idea of the documentation. And one of the things that, I know it's very obvious that it's evidence-based, but one of the things that I thought about as Dr. Selden was saying that, and then going through the process of putting it together, was to sort of use this idea as a way to guide you. If you write something in your narrative and then you're trying to put together some of that documentation that you're going to put into an appendix, and then you realize you don't really have documentation, you don't really have anything. In the case of maybe an article that you wrote, okay, you have the article, but there are other things that you might have been writing about in your narrative, and then when you get to actually collecting those documents, you're like, oh, okay, I don't really quite have what I thought. Well, maybe that should sort of guide you to go back and revise what you wrote in the narrative. Maybe that means that this is not the most important thing that you did. Look over your collection of evidence. Are there other things that are actually more important? And sort of use this as kind of like a going back and forth. You have the narrative, you have the documentation that supports it, and then go back and, you know, sort of go the other way and use this to kind of guide you in this process. Keep focus on what is most important. Again, 20 pages, even though it may seem somewhat daunting at first, oh, I have to sit down and write 20 pages about what I do. It's really not enough to adequately describe everything that you do in the classroom, everything you do in your research, and so forth. So just try to keep in mind that this is supposed to be simply a highlight. And again, this will, I think, in that sort of reflective process, help you to go back and sort of think about, okay, what are the most important things that I've done? And again, this idea of the significant accomplishments, and one of the parts of the sort of integration area towards the end of this document allows you to sort of think about what are these 3 accomplishments that I've made, and then again, thinking towards the future, these 3 professional goals. Keep that in mind. Keep this idea of the highlight, the most important things, the things that you really want, as if you're literally taking a highlighter and highlighting these things in your CV as if you were handing it to someone. So use your appendix as a way to collect that documentation and provide something, like in the case of a list. Every conference presentation that you've given, well, you can put a list of that in the appendix, along with documentation relating to the 3 most important presentations you've ever given at the most important conferences, or ones that were really essential to how your research progressed and the interactions that you had with colleagues at that conference. It's your decision what the 3 most important things were. And again, this is a way to sort of help you sift through all this, determine what's important, and then how you're going to present it. And again, going back to what Dr. Allen said about that you make the context for your case. You are the guide as people are going to be going through this. And thinking about this idea of people going through this and literally reading through these portfolios, and again, keep in mind that people, particularly on the Tenure and Promotion Committee, are going to be reading a lot of these. So you want to make sure that you get to the point, you make the case, and you do it in such a way that people are not going to be bored. I would like to think that nobody's bored by reading one of these, but variety, and thinking about how your narrative is being presented, how people are going to read it, how they're going to look at it in a visual sense. So don't just write an essay that lasts for 20 pages. Think about breaking that up, including tables or charts. And this is particularly an effective way to present some kinds of information. In mine, I made a table that analyzed my student evaluations and the ratings on them. I made a chart for some curricular revisions that I've been involved in, for the kinds of classes that I teach. It's a helpful way to present information. Some of you in the sciences probably make these kinds of tables and charts all the time, and you're used to presenting information in that way. I think in the humanities, a lot of us are not so used to doing that. But as my mentor in the workshop read over the page of narrative I had in which I described the courses that I teach, he looked at that and he said, you could put that all on a chart. It could take up, a third of the page. You could save some space. It's going to be a way of presenting it visually that's more exciting, that's easy to read, that people are going to look at this and say, I get it, and I don't need to weed through all this, and some of it's repetitive if you teach, courses that are to the same audience, things like that. And as I went through this with my mentor, one of the things that he helped me do was to pinpoint examples in the book that were along the lines of what he thought maybe I could do in that particular section. So as you read the book, know that only the first couple chapters are really kind of their narrative. And then the whole rest of it are all these examples that you can use as models. And if you haven't looked through the book yet, I would suggest that you look through these models. And also don't do what I did the first time when I was told to read the book before we actually had the workshop. And I read the first few chapters, and then I started to look at some of the examples, and I thought, well, these are from people in biochemistry and people who don't do anything like what I do. So I sort of skimmed through them, but I didn't really read all of those. Then as I got into it, then I realized why it's important to actually look at all these examples, because it's simply the way that people put together information, the way that it's formatted, the way that, this person X actually laid it out, the chart they used, the subcategories that they had that fit sort of what I was doing. Because in one case I changed a subcategory. I don't do this, but I do something else that my mentor suggested, well, you need to make a category for that. Adjust it to how you're doing it and use these examples, even if they don't come from, as Dr. Hart pointed out, HBCUs or people that may always be doing exactly what we're doing, but there are really some excellent models. Know your audience. This is something I always tell my students. Know who is going to be looking at this. Know how they're going to be reading this. And again, think about the people that are going to be reading this outside of your field. The senior faculty in your department who may read your portfolio first may have a pretty good idea of what you do. They may do similar things. Once you get beyond there, once you get to your dean, to the provost, to the tenure and promotion committee, you need to be able to present the information in such a way that people get it, that they understand it, that you're not using jargon, that you're not talking about things that are so discipline specific. So as Dr. Selden suggested to us, we should think about that this is presented in such a way, written in such a way that your grandmother could read it. Think about the fact that your audience are academics, but not necessarily in your field. So make sure that you say things in a way that they are going to be able to understand it. And again, this idea of working with a mentor, which pretty much everybody has touched upon here. Certainly there were a lot of senior faculty that participated in the workshops last month. You may know them in your department. You may be able to go to them specifically, or other senior faculty that maybe have mentored you in your time here. Ask other people to read through your portfolio. Senior faculty in your department, others outside of your discipline who can maybe give you some of that feedback as to, is this too specific? Is this something that could be understood by someone outside of your discipline? People who are going to be able to read this in such a way that it allows you to see things that you didn't see the first time. And then finally, this idea of integration, this last component in which you talk about you as a person and all the things that you do, how they come together. Think about a theme. Think about what it is that brings all these ideas together. And sometimes these themes are not so evident until you've actually written the rest of your narrative. And then you go back and you look at it and you say, oh, well, there is this idea, this concept that emerges, this value, this thing that's important to me that actually colors every aspect of my life. It colors my teaching, my research, my service, and I didn't even realize it. So sometimes you have to kind of, it's like writing the introduction to a book where you have to, write what the content is and then go back and do that. And again, asking a mentor can sometimes also be a way to allow somebody else to see this information and then help to say, oh, I see a theme here. Is this something you consciously do? Or, it can sort of help to create that kind of discussion. And again, I know this idea of this sort of middle bullet point, people are probably, sort of at least inwardly rolling their eyes. Who has time to really seriously think about these things, to think about these values that are important, this integration, especially in the remaining days until September 30th. But as you move through this, I would encourage, at least briefly, to think about how these ideas come together, because in my listening to my colleagues in the workshop talk and looking at other people's portfolios and talking about my own portfolio with my mentor and with others, that's one of the ways in which you can really pull things together and that you can really help to sort of make the context for your case that Dr. Allen was talking about earlier. So those are some of the things that I learned and some of the advice that I could pass on to you. If you have any questions.